So again, my name is Hannah Hussey. I am a staff attorney here at GLAD Law. And for those of you who aren't familiar with GLAD Law, we're an organization committed to realizing a just society free from discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, and HIV status. We do so through a mix of litigation, public policy, and education, both here in New England and also nationally. We don't do this work alone, so I really appreciate all of you joining us today. I'll note that this is intended to be a community briefing that's off the record for press. We're already seeing the incoming administration take steps to roll back existing protections, both for immigrants and LGBTQ people, and certainly understand that this is a scary time for many and that there are unique concerns for LGBTQ immigrants in particular. None of us can predict exactly how the coming weeks and months will unfold, but one of the ways to prepare ourselves is to equip ourselves with information about what we do know as of right now. And to that end, I'm so grateful to introduce Marianne Staniunas and Irene Freidel. Marianne is the Pro Bono Immigration Counsel at Ropes and Gray, and Irene is the Detention Program Manager at the Political Asylum Immigration Representation Project, also known as PAIR Project. They're both incredible experts and advocates, and we're so fortunate to have them here. They will be sharing some information today about the immigration system and rights that we all have that everyone should know about related to immigration. We're going to try to save some time at the end for general questions, but I just want to let folks know we're not going to be able to provide any individualized legal advice on this call. We certainly encourage anyone with questions about your own situation to consult with an immigration attorney, and we'll share some resources about how to find an attorney during this session. GLAD isn't an immigration law organization, but you can always contact our helpline, GLAD Answers, or our partner, National Center for Lesbian Rights, to get generalized resources, referrals, or more individualized guidance. And we actually have someone here from the National Center for Lesbian Rights, NCLR, with us tonight. I'm delighted to introduce Pam Mercado Garcia, who's going to give a brief overview of NCLR's work.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Pamela, and I am the Immigration Project Associate here at NCLR. We are a national feminist-founded legal organization that is committed to advance civil and human rights for LGBTQIA+ folks through litigation, legislation, policy, and public education. And Program Hogar, which is our immigration direct service program, assist LGBTQIA+ folks with their immigration cases. We mainly work with asylum seekers. However, we also have some TPS cases, adjustment of status, naturalization, and some U visa cases. And to get in contact with us for just generalized help, you can go to our helpline. And you could also go to our helpline if you are seeking just legal assistance with your immigration relief questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Pam. So I'm going to, without any further ado, turn it over to Marianne and Irene, who are going to take us through some of the information tonight.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Pam, for the introductions. We're so happy to be able to be here tonight. I'm going to start off, and then Irene's going to pick it up a little bit later. But I do want to just emphasize what Hannah said earlier. The information that we're sharing tonight is all publicly available information, and nothing that we're sharing tonight is intended to be or should be considered to be legal advice. We are here to help you to know your rights and hopefully make you feel a little more empowered to exercise those rights. Next slide. So our goals for today, so learning about some basic forms about the immigration system and some basic forms of relief that are often available to folks, to give you a little bit of background there. Learning about your rights in case you encounter immigration officials, and learn how to kind of best prepare yourself and your family, and potentially where to go for help given kind of the uncertainty of what is ahead. Next slide. So I'm going to start by giving kind of just an overview of the immigration process and sort of the different pieces of the immigration system, to give you sort of just a foundation of where we're starting off. Next slide. So, what is the immigration process? What are the immigration agencies? Kind of what are the very fundamental basics? So there are two in our federal government that are responsible for the vast majority of immigration cases and circumstances that happen within the United States. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And those are the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. Within the Department of Homeland Security, there are three sort of sub-agencies that you may hear about a lot in immigration cases and situations. The first one is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, often called USCIS. And these are the immigration bureaucrats, as I like to say. So this is the agency that processes applications for forms of relief that are available to folks who are within the United States. So we'll be talking some more about those applications, but those are when people are typically are already present within the United States and are seeking to obtain some kind of immigration benefit. Sometimes that might be a work authorization card or the extension of a visa, or some of the kinds of humanitarian relief that we'll be talking about later. The next agency is customs, or sub-agency is the Customs and Border Protection. So you can think of these folks as like the immigration police at the borders of the United States. And then we have Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And Immigration and Customs Enforcement actually has two roles. They are the immigration police within the interior of the United States. So they enforce immigration laws within the United States. And they also serve as the prosecuting attorneys in immigration court proceedings. And then that gets us to the Department of Justice. So within the Department of Justice, we have the Executive Office of Immigration Review, or for Immigration Review, and that is the official name for the Immigration Court. So the Immigration Court is not a true court. It is it's a sub-agency of the federal government. It's part of the executive branch. But these are the judges. They are called judges, immigration judges, and they can make decisions about folks who are in immigration proceedings. And we'll talk a little bit more about how someone gets into immigration proceedings. But basically, these are folks who have been found to be in the United States without, or have been accused of being in the United States without having any lawful basis for being here. And even when you are someone who's within the United States without having a lawful basis for being here, you still have the right to a legal proceeding to adjudicate whether or not you can be formally removed or deported from the United States. And all of those cases are handled through the Immigration Court, or EOIR. And within that immigration proceeding, you can assert forms of protection from removal, or if you have a reason to remain in the United States because you are benefiting from a certain kind of immigration benefit. And we can talk more about sort of how that all plays out once I give a little bit more sense of substance. So I'll go to the next slide. What we're going to talk about a little bit now is some common forms of immigration relief. And I'll tell you a little bit about the forms themselves, and then we'll talk more about where you would apply for this kind of form of relief and how someone would take advantage of this, and then how it would play out in the actual immigration proceedings. So these common forms, you may have heard of them: political asylum, U visas, P visas, and protection under the Violence Against Women Act, which is not just for women or people who identify as women, and then family-based sponsorship. Go to the next slide. So political asylum. So basically, asylum is a protection that is granted to foreign nationals of non-nationals of the United States who meet the definition of a refugee. So that is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their home country, and cannot obtain protection in that country because they have experienced past persecution or have a well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future. And that fear of persecution has to be on one of 5 protected grounds, which I listed here: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And membership in a particular social group is kind of a very broad and ill-defined category in some ways, but one thing I want to specifically point to is that there are particular social groups are frequently established based on someone's gender identity and or sexual orientation. We'll go to the next slide. Political asylum is a form of relief that someone can apply for either affirmatively before Citizenship and Immigration Services, or as a defense to deportation in immigration court once you've been put into immigration proceedings. So it's kind of it's a special form of relief because many of the forms of relief are only able to be adjudicated or processed by either U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services or the immigration court. But with asylum, where you seek asylum depends on whether you are already in immigration proceedings or not in immigration proceedings. I'll go to the next slide. So U visas are visas for survivors of crimes who have information and are willing to assist with the investigation of the persecution of the crime. So I'm listing out kind of some characteristics, but this is someone who has experienced a crime in the United States, has reported that crime to some form of law enforcement, and that could be the police, or sometimes it's another service provider. I'm sorry, I'm losing all of my acronyms. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the police, but you've provided some assistance to law enforcement, and you have yourself suffered because of the injury due to the crime. You were able to get a certification from law enforcement, and when you have all these pieces together, you can apply to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to try to request that you be granted, placed on a path to getting permanent residence in the United States. And kind of, which probably makes sense, but when you think about it, the U visa was created as a category to encourage folks who don't have status in the United States to still be willing to work with law enforcement to prosecute crimes that happen to them and to happen to their neighbors and happen to their families, to encourage folks to not be afraid to report crimes, essentially. Next slide. So T visas are visas for individuals who are present in the United States as a result of human trafficking, and that can be trafficking, both sex trafficking and or labor trafficking. And survivors don't have to be experiencing ongoing trafficking, but there has to be a connection to their being in the United States and the trafficking that they experienced. In this case, someone who has who's experienced trafficking has to be willing to comply with any requests from law enforcement for assistance, but they don't need to have a certification from law enforcement that they have. Definitely that they don't have to receive a formal certification from law enforcement that they have provided assistance. And they also have to show that they would experience extreme hardship if they were forced to leave the United States. And that extreme hardship can be directly related to the trafficking. It can be tangentially related to the trafficking. But again, this category was also created to help folks not be afraid to report when they have been the survivor of a pretty extreme crime, and to help U.S. law enforcement prosecute those who are perpetrating human trafficking. Next slide. Protection under the Violence Against Women Act. So this is for survivors of domestic violence. And I always want to start by saying, if you are a survivor of domestic violence, you have the right to be safe, regardless of your legal status in the United States. So I feel like that's always the most important thing to emphasize. But if you are a survivor of domestic violence at the hands of a U.S. permanent resident or U.S. citizen, there may be a pathway for you to be on a path to getting permanent residence in the United States. And again, there are not specific reporting requirements in the VAWA context, but there is the process of documenting the domestic violence that you have experienced, which can be obviously a very difficult process. But this was intended to specifically protect survivors of domestic violence. Next slide. And so finally, I'll talk about family-based sponsorship. So US citizens and permanent residents can sponsor certain family members for permanent residence in the United States. US citizens can sponsor spouses, children, parents, and siblings, and permanent residents can sponsor spouses and unmarried children. There are a couple of caveats around this, one being that there's often a years-long wait for permanent residence in some categories because there's a limited number of visas available, permanent residence visas available. And those categories are oversubscribed every year. So more people than there are eligible visas apply for these statuses each year, which means that, and this happens year over year, so it means that there's basically a long waiting line for many of these categories. And another challenge is that in order to benefit from most family-based sponsorship, you need to have entered the United States lawfully the first time around. So you need to at least have entered the United States on a visa or with some other permission, or you have to obtain a waiver. Next slide. So actually, before I get into this, how do I know if I'm in immigration proceedings? I will pause by just saying that of the forms of relief that we just were discussing, all of the applications for those forms of relief would be filed, with the exception of the asylum application, would be filed initially with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And so U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, I'm sorry, I just gotta note that I'm talking too quickly, which happens a lot. The forms of relief that we were just discussing would mostly be filed with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And they would process the VAWAs, the T visas, the U visas, and whether or not someone is in immigration proceedings. How do I know if I'm in immigration proceedings? Well, like any other kind of court proceeding, the government has to take action to place someone into immigration proceedings. So it's not as simple as I'm present in the United States, therefore I must be in immigration proceedings. The government has to identify that they believe you are in the United States without authorization and issue what's called a notice to appear. And that's the document that where the government says, we believe you are present in the United States without the right to be here, and we believe that we can remove you from the United States. And the government then files that notice to appear with the immigration court to officially put you into immigration proceedings. Once you are in immigration proceedings, that's where the immigration court will have jurisdiction, will have control over an asylum application if you wanted to file an asylum application, and down the road some other kinds of other kinds of applications. However, as we just discussed, even if you are in immigration proceedings, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services will still process and decide T visa, U visa, VAWA, or family-based petitions, which can sometimes mean that you're informing the immigration court that I would like to, I have these applications, or I have an application pending with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which you don't have jurisdiction over when you are in the court. And that can affect how quickly your court proceedings will advance. Next slide. couple other kind of really important notes. There is no right to free counsel in immigration court. So you are entitled to have an attorney in immigration court. But unlike criminal cases, you don't have a right to a free counsel. So the government does not have to appoint you a counsel. And whether or not you are in immigration proceedings, if you are present in the United States without status, there is a risk that you could be identified and arrested by ICE. An arrest by ICE would then result in your being placed into immigration proceedings, and it could result in your being placed into custody or what's called detention. Next slide. Irene's going to jump in now, and I want to just kind of apologize in advance because I feel like that was an incredibly fast, very quick overview of a lot of information. We will be sharing all of these slides afterwards, and I know we'll be taking some questions, but I'll have Irene jump in and continue.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening and participating today. Thank you, Marianne, and to GLAD and NCLR. Okay. It's really, really important that if you have a case in the immigration court, you attend your court hearing. If you don't go to your scheduled court hearing, you will be ordered deported. Even if you don't have a lawyer yet, you should go to your hearing and ask the judge for more time to find a lawyer. Obviously, many people are terrified of going to court, but the solution is not to not go, because once you are ordered removed, it will always stay with you. So hypothetically, if you're ordered removed, no one knows, ICE doesn't find you, you could live in the US for a couple years before anyone comes knocking on your door, but eventually it will catch up with you. There are ways to reopen the case if you miss a court hearing, and usually that requires you to be able to say you didn't get notice. So maybe for some reason the mail got destroyed. There was a terrible catastrophic storm and you never received the mail. You find out later that you've been ordered deported because there was a hearing that you received no notice to. That is the kind of that's the kind of scenario where you may be able to reopen your case and get the order of removal vacated. But the real point is really try to stay on top of when your court date is. Even if you don't get a notice in the mail, you can check online. You can use the address on the slide online. You can call the phone number on the slide. If you have your A number, your alien number, which we call the A number, you just put it into the system and it will tell you when your next court date is. Next slide. So if you've never been ordered deported before, you have the right to see an immigration judge to fight your case. If you have been ordered deported previously, maybe you've already entered the US once, you were sent back when you crossed the border, you won't automatically see a judge a second time. It is crucial that if you are afraid of returning to your home country, that you express that fear to ICE and be prepared to explain why. If you don't say you are afraid, or if you say it and you're not convinced the ICE officers heard you, you need to be really clear and loud so they understand. Once you say you are afraid, it triggers certain protections. You have the right to seek protection if you're afraid of going back to your home country, even if you have already been ordered deported. You may not have the right to seek asylum, but there are other protections that are like asylum that you can avail yourself of. One of them is protection under the Convention Against Torture, and that is a really crucial protection for members of the LGBTQ+ community. If you have an ankle bracelet or you are required to check in with ICE, this is a separate requirement from going to the immigration court, and you need to follow the requirements that ICE imposes on you to check in. And you'll have a copy of these slides, but on the slide, you'll see the website where you check in the first time, and then the email address you can use to check in for subsequent appointments. If you have ICE check-ins and you have not consulted with a lawyer, we strongly recommend that you try to connect with a lawyer. Next slide. Okay, these are possible deportation defenses that Marianne has already run through. So you'll have the slide. We don't need to go through it, except to say, really do your best to find an immigration lawyer. In immigration court, your chance of success is 5 times higher if you have a lawyer, if you are not detained by ICE. So 5 times, you're 5 times more likely to win your case if you have a lawyer. If you're detained, you are 10 times more likely to succeed in your case if you have a lawyer. So if you have no status now and you know you have a court date coming, try everything you can. Do not wait. Do not procrastinate. Do everything you can to find a lawyer. And when I get closer to the end of these slides, we'll have some resources for you. Next slide, please. What happens when you meet ICE, an immigration officer? Next slide. Everyone in the United States, every one of you listening today, everyone standing on US soil has rights under the US Constitution. That is true, regardless of who is president of the United States. These are rights that are important for you to be knowledgeable of, and you should tell other members of the community if you know people who do not have legal status. You have the right to remain silent. That means you don't have to answer any questions. You have the right to see an arrest warrant, and we're going to talk in a minute about what that means. You have the right to speak to a lawyer, and you have the right to make a phone call. This is true whether you are being arrested by the police outside of immigration. It is true if you are arrested by ICE or if ICE comes knocking on your door at home. Next slide. It is true wherever you are going about your daily life, you have those rights. If you have immigration status and ICE comes and approaches you and asks, like say you get stopped in a car and ICE asks for your identification, you may wish to show your ID to prove you're here legally, whether it's a passport, a green card, a work permit. If you don't have immigration status and you don't want to reveal that and that you're not a US citizen, you have the right to be silent, which means you can not show your ID, or you can choose not to carry your ID with you. If you don't have your ID, ICE won't know who you are if you don't tell them. So it's very hard. We all know it's hard to remain silent, but it is better to remain silent than to lie or show false documents. It's better to remain silent if you are undocumented and you're concerned about being detained and put in ICE custody. Next slide. So what happens if ICE knocks on your door? Imagine that you live, or maybe you do, live in an apartment building, and ICE decides to come and arrest somebody who lives in your building. They might, and they have, knock on every door in the apartment building just to see who opens the door. It's hard to not comply with law enforcement. So they knock on doors, they ask to come in, they ask for names, they'll ask for your identification. Often people hand over this information and end up in trouble. So you don't have to let ICE in your door or the police just because they're knocking. They only have the right to enter your home if they have a search warrant signed by a judge. It is possible if you can get these on the internet, and we have these cards. They're called Know Your Rights cards. They're little red cards, and they say in multiple languages, I am exercising my rights under the United States Constitution, and I am choosing to remain silent. If you have one of these cards, and I recommend you get one if you are listening to this presentation and you do not have legal status, all you have to do when ICE comes knocking is slide the card under the door or show it at your window if you're stopped in your car at a checkpoint, for example, by the border. You can't, if ICE has a warrant, they will arrest you even if you remain silent. So you can only stop them so far, but you don't need to speak to them and voluntarily provide information. If you are arrested by ICE, or if ICE has come to your home, it's good to tell somebody with legal status what's happening. And again, try to call an immigration attorney. Next slide. This is an image of a valid search warrant. So as you can see, there's a judge signature. I mean, this is obviously a little bit of a cartoonish depiction, but a valid search warrant will have a signature at the bottom by a judge and the name of the court on the document where the judge resides. Next slide. So here is an actual image of a valid search warrant because it is signed by a judge at the bottom. You can barely see it, but the very bottom says signature of judge, and the top of the page identifies the court as the United States District Court for the Northern District of Iowa. Okay, next slide. This document is not a valid arrest warrant because it's not issued by a court. The document at the top, this is a common document that ICE uses. It says warrant for arrest of alien, but it's issued by the Department of Homeland Security, not a court, and it is not signed by a judge. So if ICE comes knocking, you can ask, show me your warrant, and look at it if they have one, and make sure it's signed by a judge. Okay, next slide. A lot of people are stopped by ICE while they're driving. It could be you're driving without a license. You're driving on a suspended license. You're driving under the influence of alcohol or another substance. Any of these events, or none of them, it could just be you're driving and you're stopped at a checkpoint, could lead to ICE trying to arrest you. And again, you have the right to remain silent even when you are in your car. You can ask if you are under arrest or if you're free to leave. Don't resist arrest. If they're trying to arrest you, unfortunately, there's not much you can do. If you're free to leave, you can say you are leaving. If you're not being arrested, you can refuse to be fingerprinted, and that is part of your right to remain silent. There are these little fingerprint machines that sometimes officers use, and they'll pull them out and get your fingerprint on the spot. You can refuse to do that. Next slide. A lot of people are being picked up by the Canadian border in Vermont. I represent people in detention, so I'm the detention program manager at PAIR, and every week we go into the detention facilities here and we meet people who either entered the United States from Canada or they went up to Vermont and they were in the vicinity of the Canadian border. Vicinity meaning 50 miles, 100 miles, and there are checkpoints, and they get stopped by ICE and hauled into detention. So we tell people, if you don't have to be near the Canadian border, do not go near the Canadian border. Now is not the time to go to Niagara Falls for vacation. And this is not meant to be funny. I've heard every story in the world of people who have been picked up near the Canadian border. Either they were there, they decided to go on vacation, they took a job on the border. Like, I had a guy who took a job a mile from the Canadian border because it seemed like a good idea, but he had no legal status. At any rate, try to avoid those states by the border if you do not have legal status. Next slide. If ICE comes to your workplace, which we are anticipating could happen, you have the right again to remain silent. That means if ICE barges in to a factory floor where you're working, or a warehouse floor, or a construction site, and they say, if you have legal status, stand in the right side of the room. If you have no legal status, stand on the left side of the room. You don't have to move. You can stand right where you are, because by lining up, you are going to reveal your lack of status. Of course, if you don't move, ICE can conclude that you don't have status, but they need some information to arrest you. If they don't know your status, if they don't know your name, if they don't have your fingerprint, they are less likely to be able to arrest you and put you in detention. Next slide. This is a busy slide, and I've already covered this, but there are different reasons why you could get picked up by ICE. And I've covered most of these. You could get any kind of criminal charge or arrest if you are not authorized to be in the US, could land you in detention. Domestic violence is a very common reason why people end up in detention. Two partners having an argument, one calls the police show up, and whoever is accused of being the aggressor or the perpetrator will almost certainly be taken first to court, and then from court into ICE custody. ICE is present in our courthouses. So if you do not have status and you go to court, say you, it could be any kind of offense. You might have been put in jail overnight. Once you say you get called and you're arrested for shoplifting or domestic violence, you get put overnight in jail. The judge sets a bail amount of $500. You pay bail thinking you're going to be released and you get to go home, but no, you pay bail, and then ICE is waiting for you in the basement of the courthouse, and you will then end up in ICE custody. So I can't stress enough how important it is to stay out of the criminal justice system if you are not in the US legally. Next slide. Okay, we're going to talk very briefly about immigration detention. So my organization regularly visits two of the facilities that feed into the court here in Massachusetts, and that is the Plymouth County Correctional Facility in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and the Wyatt Detention Facility in Central Falls, Rhode Island. So I know we have some people participating who are not in Massachusetts or New England. If you are in New England, you may well find yourself in one of these facilities if you are detained by ICE. There is also a facility in New Hampshire and another one in Maine, the Cumberland County Jail. There is, I don't know if I have a slide on this, it might be coming up, but for family and friends, there is a website where they can put your name and information into a platform to find out where you are located if you're in detention. If you are detained, you should call our office, the PAIR Project. Our phone number is there. We do one-on-one consultations. If anyone you know is detained, you can contact our office. Hopefully, no one you know will be detained and you will not be detained. This is civil custody, but you are held in a jail and you will not feel anything other than you will wonder how you could be there and not have violated, like not done something to incur a criminal charge, because you will be treated as if you are in criminal custody. Next slide. If you find yourself in detention and you are comfortable doing so, tell a facility employee or a guard of your gender identity or sexual orientation. The facility is required to provide accommodations, such as a single cell without a roommate and private shower time and potentially other accommodations. Unfortunately, they will place you in the unit that coincides with your gender at birth. There is a facility apparently in Colorado for trans individuals. And if you complain loudly enough, they will ask if you want to be transferred to Colorado, which you may not want to be if it is away from your family and friends. But you should, we have met many, many people who, needless to say, are not comfortable speaking openly of their sexual orientation or gender identity in the jail facilities. And we have met people who are, and they are treated differently. Again, if you are in a facility in New England, please contact our office. You have to aggressively advocate for yourself for any medical care that you might need, HIV meds, gender care, any of those things. You have to really be a self-advocate. Prisoner legal services in Massachusetts can help if you are having trouble getting care, proper medical care, for example, or you're not being treated properly because you're suffering discrimination based on your gender identity or sexual orientation. And you've got the phone numbers there. Next slide. After an ICE arrest, anybody without legal status here should not visit the detainee. Here's the address at the bottom for the detainee locator. That's the address online where somebody can look up another person to find out where they are located. Is if you don't have authorized status in the US, make sure that somebody close to you has your data, your name, your date of birth, any important documents, your birth certificate, whatever you have that's important to you. Make sure you have copies of it or originals with a trusted friend or family member. Next slide. If you are arrested by ICE, you may be able to get released from custody through bond, what's called bond. It is like bail in criminal court, but bond is decided by an immigration judge. Not everybody is eligible for bond, and you need to consult with a lawyer to find out if you are bond eligible. That is the kind of thing that we do. If you have no criminal history and you have some family or community ties, you will have a much easier time getting granted bond. And the bond amounts range from as low as, quote unquote, low as $1,500 up. There's no limit, but up to, we typically see up to $12,000. And there are community funds that assist in paying bonds for individuals in ICE custody. Next slide. If you are not released on bond, you will have to present your case in the immigration court while you are detained. And that means if you are seeking asylum, you will have to present your asylum case while you are detained. That can take right now about 6 to 12 months. One thing I want to mention, because it's very important, if you have not filed asylum within 1 year of entering the US, and you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, there are exceptions to the 1 year deadline that you will likely benefit from. So do not think to yourself, I haven't applied within 1 year. I will not be able to apply. There's no reason. Don't lose hope. You absolutely can apply even though more than 1 year has passed. Again, you need to find a lawyer, and I recommend you call the PAIR Project. Next slide. Okay, I know we're running out of time, so I will go through this quickly. Next slide. What can your family do? What can you do to prepare for the worst case scenario? If you are the one detained, you want to have memorized the phone numbers of friends, family, your attorney. You can have a little piece of paper in your pocket that you take with you everywhere you go. Think about, again, where to keep your important documents safe. If you have a family member, again, make sure they have either the originals or copies of your important documents. Also, if you have evidence supporting an asylum case, or other helpful evidence that could be relevant to your immigration case, make sure you keep a copy with a friend or family member so they can access it if you are detained. Assume that whatever you have on you will be put into property storage. You will not have access to it when you are detained. You will not have access to your own cell phone. So whatever is crucially important in your life, make sure you have a copy of it somewhere that somebody can access. Next slide. This is also true for emergency contacts. If you have US-born children, you may want to register their births with your own consulate. You might get them passports so they have identification showing they're US citizens. Authorize your children's schools, or provide authorization for people who can pick up your children at school or who cannot pick up your children. Next slide. And you can prepare a caregiver affidavit authorization, or an agent authorization that will give other people powers to do things for your children if you are absent, if you are put into custody. We call this a toolkit, and there's more information at this website at the bottom. So we only are just flagging it today, but if this is something you want to do, you can get more information online with all the documents that you need to actually complete and execute this process. Next slide. Where can you go for help? Next slide. Do not use somebody called a notary or a notario publico. This is not the same thing as a lawyer. They are not authorized to provide legal advice. They will charge you money and they will do a terrible job. So be super cautious. When you hire a lawyer, make sure that they are actually a lawyer, and give your lawyer all of the information that is relevant to your case, including any information about your criminal records or history, if any. Next slide. We obviously are thinking a lot of things might change after January 20th. These are organizations here on the slide that provide legal services that can help you get connected to a lawyer. We'll give you information that's up to date on programs like DACA, temporary protected status. Next slide. And then the rest of the slides for this presentation all have useful information for where you can get help. Next slide. So my organization, the PAIR Project, is at the top of this list. If you are listening to this presentation right now and you need a pro bono, meaning a free lawyer, to help you with an asylum claim, call the PAIR Project tomorrow or Thursday, because this week we are actively screening cases. We do that at intervals, and we are doing it right now this week. So please call us. And if you're not able to do it this week, still call us when you're able to. And if you can't get anyone on the phone, keep calling. That is a huge issue with every organization here because they're getting deluged with calls for help. Next slide. So keep going. Next slide. These are two fabulous organizations that provide amazing support individually for cases and impact litigation for LGBTQ plus immigrants. They are I just can't say enough about them. I've worked with them on cases and I think they're phenomenal. Immigration Equality is in New York. The National Immigrant Justice Center is in the Midwest, in the Chicago area. They both provide resources for individuals all over the country. And next slide. I think that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and please reach out to us with any questions.